November 1970, London. The heating had failed again in the cramped rehearsal space above a furniture store in Kensington. Outside, freezing rain battered the windows with a rhythm that seemed almost mocking, as if nature itself was reminding the four struggling musicians inside that the world didn't care about their dreams. The room smelled of damp wood, stale cigarette smoke, and the particular kind of desperation that clings to artists who are running out of time and money. In the corner, beneath a single bare bulb that cast harsh shadows across the cluttered space, sat an ancient, upright piano. The instrument was a wreck. Several keys stuck when pressed. Others produced notes that were wildly out of tune, creating discordant sounds that would make any trained musician wince. The finish had long since worn away, revealing bare wood scarred with cigarette burns and water stains. Someone had carved initials into the side. One of the legs had been replaced with a stack of books to keep it level. It was, by any reasonable assessment, a piano that should have been hauled away as garbage years ago, and yet Freddie Mercury sat at that broken piano as if it were a Steinway Grand at Royal Albert Hall. His fingers moved across the damaged keys with surprising gentleness, coaxing whatever music the instrument could still produce. He was humming softly, almost unconsciously, fragments of melodies that seemed to emerge from somewhere deep within him. The cold didn't seem to touch him. The dismal surroundings didn't register. In that moment, hunched over that ruined piano, Freddie Mercury existed in a space between worlds, somewhere music mattered more than physical reality. Brian May stood near the window, watching his friend with growing frustration. They had been rehearsing for hours, or trying to rehearse, but the session had devolved into what all their recent rehearsals had become. The four of them playing competent covers of other people's songs, while their own original material remained unfinished, unpolished, and honestly, uninspiring. Brian was exhausted, not just physically tired from long hours of practice, but exhausted in his soul. He was 23 years old, supposedly working on his doctorate in astrophysics at Imperial College, but spending every available hour with this band that seemed destined to remain perpetually on the verge of something without ever actually arriving. His father asked him weekly when he was going to finish his degree and pursue a real career. His mother worried about his health. His professors were losing patience with his frequent absences. And here they were in a freezing room with a broken piano and a singer who couldn't stop humming Elvis Presley songs. "Why do you always do that?" Brian asked suddenly, his voice cutting through the quiet. The frustration he'd been suppressing for weeks emerged sharper than he'd intended. Freddie's fingers stopped moving. He looked up, pulled abruptly from whatever internal landscape he'd been exploring. "Do what, darling?" Freddie replied, his tone carefully neutral. "That humming. Those songs." Brian gestured vaguely toward the piano. "They're all the same, old rock and roll, Elvis, Chuck Berry, Little Richard. You're constantly going back to that well, constantly referencing that sound. And I don't understand why, because we're trying to create something new, something that's ours, and you keep pulling us backward." The words hung in the cold air between them. Roger and John, who had been packing equipment on the other side of the room, stopped moving, sensing the sudden tension. Freddie was silent for a long moment, his hands resting on the broken keys. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer, more contemplative than Brian had heard in months. "Do you want to know why I can't stop singing those songs, Brian? Do you really want to understand?" Brian nodded, surprised by the question. Freddie stood slowly, walked to the window, and stared out at the rain-soaked London streets below. The weak afternoon light caught his profile, highlighting the distinctive features that would one day become iconic, but which, in 1970, still belonged to an unknown immigrant trying to find his place in British culture. "When I was 8 years old," Freddie began, his voice carrying a weight Brian had never heard before, "I was sent to boarding school in India, St. Peter's School in Panchgani. My parents thought it would give me discipline, education, a proper British upbringing, even though we were thousands of miles from Britain." He paused, his breath fogging the cold window glass. "Every Sunday morning, we had to attend chapel services. The school had a choir, and because I could carry a tune, they put me in it. We sang hymns, traditional Christian songs in perfect harmony. The choir master was a strict man who believed that every note should be executed with absolute precision. No deviation, no personality, just technical perfection in service of tradition. Freddie turned back to face Brian, his eyes reflecting something that looked almost like pain. I was good at it, very good. I could match any note they gave me. I could blend my voice into the group until it was indistinguishable from the whole. I was praised for my obedience, my technical skill, my ability to disappear into the collective sound. He walked back toward the piano, his hand trailing along its damaged surface. Then one summer holiday, I was 13, I heard Elvis Presley for the first time on someone's radio. Jailhouse Rock was playing, and it was like lightning struck my chest. This wasn't careful harmonies or religious discipline. This was raw power, sexuality, rebellion, joy, everything the choir master had trained out of me. This was a human being refusing to disappear, demanding to be seen and heard exactly as he was. Freddie sat back down at the piano, his fingers finding the keys again. I became obsessed. I spent every penny I could earn or steal buying Elvis records. I listened to them until I had memorized every vocal inflection, every breath, every subtle variation in his phrasing. I taught myself to sing exactly like him, not similar to him, exactly like him. I could reproduce his voice so perfectly that when I sang along to the records, you couldn't distinguish my voice from his. Brian found himself leaning forward, drawn into the story despite his earlier frustration. For years, that's what I did, Freddie continued, his voice growing quieter. I perfected the art of imitation. Elvis was my new choir master, and instead of disappearing into hymns, I disappeared into his songs. I thought that's what being a singer meant, finding someone whose voice you admired and learning to replicate it flawlessly. Freddie's fingers began to move across the keys, picking out a simple melody that Brian didn't recognize. But then something happened. I was 16, home from school, practicing in my bedroom as usual. I was singing Love Me Tender, matching Elvis note for note, and suddenly I just stopped. I looked at myself in the mirror, and I hated what I saw. Not because I wasn't good at the imitation. I hated it because it was perfect. I had become so skilled at being Elvis that I had no idea who Farouk Bulsara was, or what his voice sounded like, or whether he had anything worth saying that was his own. The melody emerging from the broken piano grew more complex, more distinctively not Elvis. I sat down at my mother's piano that night, Freddie said, his eyes focused somewhere beyond the present moment. And I started pressing keys randomly, not trying to replicate anything I'd heard, just listening to what sounds emerged. Some of them were terrible, some were interesting. And slowly, painfully, I began to hear something. My own voice, my own musical ideas. Chords and progressions that didn't come from Elvis or the choir master or anyone else. They came from whatever lived inside me that was uniquely mine. He played a series of chords that made Brian's breath catch, recognizing the seeds of what would eventually become parts of Bohemian Rhapsody, though that song wouldn't exist for another 5 years. That's why I still hum those old songs, Brian, Freddie said, looking directly at his friend. Not because I want to sound like Elvis, because I need to remember where I came from. I need to remember that I started as a mimic, a copy, someone who was afraid his own voice wasn't good enough. And I need to remember the night I decided to stop being a copy and start being whatever the hell I actually am. Freddie's hand stilled on the keys. I don't know if I have natural talent or if I'm cursed with ambition that exceeds my abilities. But I do know that I finally started hearing my own music, Brian. And that music is so much more magnificent than anything Elvis ever recorded. Not because Elvis wasn't brilliant, but because this music is mine. The room was completely silent except for the rain against the windows. Roger and John had stopped even pretending to pack equipment. They were staring at Freddie, seeing perhaps for the first time the depth of artistic struggle beneath his flamboyant exterior. And then, unexpectedly, Brian May began to cry. Not quiet tears that could be discreetly wiped away, but deep, racking sobs that shook his entire body. He sank into a folding chair, his face in his hands, his shoulders heaving with the force of emotion he had apparently been suppressing for longer than anyone realized. Freddie was at his side immediately, kneeling beside the chair, one hand on Brian's shoulder. Brian? What is it? What's wrong? For several minutes, Brian couldn't speak. The crying seemed to have been building for months, maybe years, and now that it had started, it wouldn't stop. Finally, gasping for breath, Brian looked up at Freddie with red, swollen eyes. "I'm a copy too, Freddie," Brian whispered, his voice breaking. "I'm a fucking copy, and I hate myself for it." Freddie's expression shifted from concern to confusion. "What are you talking about?" Brian wiped his eyes roughly with the back of his hand, but the tears kept coming. "My father wanted me to be a scientist. Dr. Harold May, electronics engineer. Brilliant mind, absolutely certain that his son should follow in his footsteps. He was so proud when I got into Imperial College. So proud that I was studying astrophysics. So convinced that I would make important discoveries, contribute to human knowledge, live a meaningful life in service of science." Brian's voice grew harder, more bitter. "But I don't want to be a scientist, Freddie. I've never wanted to be a scientist. I built that guitar." He gestured toward the red special leaning against the wall. "Not because I was interested in acoustics and engineering principles, but because I was desperate to make music and couldn't afford to buy a proper instrument. Every calculation I made, every piece of wood I shaped, every wire I strung, it was all in service of this, not science." Freddie remained kneeling, listening with complete attention. "But I can't tell him," Brian continued, his voice cracking again. "Every week he calls and asks about my research, and every week I lie to him. I tell him I'm making progress on my thesis. I describe experiments I haven't conducted. I reference papers I haven't read. I perform this elaborate pantomime of being the son he wants, the scientist he expects, because I'm terrified of disappointing him." Brian stood abruptly, pacing the small room like a caged animal. "Do you know what the worst part is? The absolute worst part? He's 67 years old, Freddie. He has heart problems. His doctor says he could have a massive coronary at any time. And I think about that every single day. I think about him dying before I've told him the truth. I think about standing at his funeral, knowing that he died believing his son was continuing his legacy, when actually his son is a failed musician playing in freezing rooms with broken pianos, chasing a dream that will probably never amount to anything." Brian turned back to Freddie, his face contorted with pain and shame. "At least you found your own voice, Freddie. At least you stopped being Elvis and became yourself. I'm still pretending to be my father's son. I'm still performing a version of Brian May that doesn't exist. And I don't know how to stop because stopping means breaking his heart or waiting until he's dead, and either option is unbearable." The confession hung in the air, raw and devastating. Roger and John stood frozen, witnesses to something deeply private that they hadn't expected to hear. Freddie stood slowly, walked to Brian, and took both of his friend's hands in his own. "Brian," he said quietly, his voice carrying absolute certainty, "I want you to go home tonight. I want you to call your father, and I want you to tell him the truth." Brian tried to pull away, shaking his head. "I can't. You don't understand. It would kill him." "No," Freddie said firmly, holding Brian's hands tighter. "What will kill him is dying without knowing his real son. What will kill him is leaving this world having loved a fiction instead of a human being. And what will kill you is carrying this lie for the rest of your life, wondering what might have been different if you'd had the courage to be honest." Brian's tears started again, but slower now, quieter. "What if he rejects me?" Brian whispered. "What if he says I've wasted my life? What if he tells me I'm a disappointment?" Freddie pulled Brian into an embrace, something neither of them had ever done before, breaking through the careful British reserve that usually governed their interactions. "Then you'll know," Freddie said into Brian's shoulder. "You'll know where you stand. You'll know what you're fighting for. But I don't think that's what will happen, Brian. I think your father loves you more than he loves his expectations, and I think he deserves the chance to prove it." Freddie pulled back, looking directly into Brian's eyes. "I'm going to try to find my own voice, Brian. I'm going to stop humming Elvis songs and start creating something that's genuinely mine. And you're going to stop pretending to be a scientist and start being the musician you actually are. We're both going to be free, and we're going to create something together that's so magnificent, so unprecedented, that no one will care where we came from or who we were supposed to be." Brian nodded slowly, unable to speak. Promise me, Freddie insisted. Promise me you'll talk to him. Tonight. I promise, Brian whispered. 3 weeks later, Brian May called Freddie at 2 in the morning. Freddie answered groggily, expecting an emergency. I told him, Brian said without preamble, his voice shaking. I told my father everything. Freddie sat up immediately, fully awake. And? He cried, Brian said, his own voice thick with emotion. He actually cried, Freddie. And then he said he'd always known. He'd always known I wasn't truly passionate about astrophysics. He'd seen me working on that guitar, heard me playing late at night when I thought everyone was asleep. He knew. What did he say? Freddie asked quietly. He said, Brian, I became an engineer because it was the path available to a working-class boy who was good with mathematics. But you have choices I never had. You have talent I never possessed. And if I've made you feel like you had to choose between your music and my love, then I've failed as a father. Those were his exact words, Freddie. His exact words. There was a long pause. He told me to quit school, Brian continued, wonder evident in his voice. He said life is too short to spend it pretending to be someone you're not. He said music is as valid a pursuit as science. Maybe more valid because it touches the human soul in ways equations never can. And then he said, Brian's voice broke, but he pushed through. He said, whatever you create, whatever music you make, just promise me one thing. Don't be a copy of anyone else. Find your own voice. Be your own man. That's all I've ever really wanted for you. Freddie felt his own eyes filling with tears. He's proud of me, Freddie, Brian whispered. My father is proud of me for being a musician. I never thought I'd hear those words. I'm glad you told him, Freddie said softly. I'm so glad you told him. Thank you, Brian said. Thank you for making me find the courage. 3 months later, Dr. Harold May suffered a massive heart attack while working in his garage. He was rushed to the hospital, where doctors worked desperately to save his life. Brian sat in the waiting room holding his mother's hand, praying to gods he wasn't sure he believed in. Harold May survived that heart attack, but just barely. The damage to his heart was extensive. The doctors said he likely had less than a year to live. Brian spent every available moment with his father during those final months. They talked about everything: life, death, regret, the nature of success, the meaning of family, and they talked about music. Harold asked to hear the songs Brian was working on. Brian brought his guitar to the hospital and played the rough drafts of tracks that would eventually appear on Queen's first album. Harold listened with the same focused attention he'd once given to engineering problems, nodding along to rhythms, humming melodies. You're good, son, Harold said after one particularly complex piece. You're genuinely good. Not good for a hobbyist or good for an amateur. Good in the way that matters. Good enough to make people feel something. Then Harold said something Brian would carry with him for the rest of his life. I'm proud of you, Brian. Not proud that you're pursuing music instead of science. Just proud of you. Proud that you had the courage to be honest. Proud that you're making your own choices. Proud that you're your own man. Harold paused, his breathing labored from the damaged heart. One more thing, son. When you make it, and you will make it, I can hear that in your music. Don't let success make you forget why you started. You started because you had something inside you that needed to get out, something uniquely yours. Don't let anyone, including yourself, turn you into a copy of someone else. Stay yourself. That's all that matters in the end. Being yourself. Harold May died on March 6, 1971, with his wife and son beside him. His last words to Brian were, make music that matters. Make music that's yours. At the funeral, Freddie stood beside Brian as the coffin was lowered into the ground. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, a quiet presence, a reminder of the promise they had made to each other in that freezing rehearsal space. 2 weeks after the funeral, Brian called Freddie. Let's do this properly, Brian said. Let's form a real band. Let's write our own songs, create our own sound, refuse to be copies of anyone who came before us. Let's make something my father would be proud of. Yes, Freddie said simply. Let's call ourselves Queen. 40 years later, Brian May would tell an interviewer about the night Freddie shared his Elvis story, and he confessed his fears about his father. The interviewer asked if that conversation had been significant to Queen's eventual success. Brian was quiet for a long moment before answering. That night changed everything, and he finally tied him, not because it changed our technical abilities or our musical knowledge. It changed us. Freddie and I both stopped trying to be what we thought we should be and started being what we actually were. And my father's final words about staying yourself, about not being a copy, those words became the foundation of everything Queen ever created. The interviewer pressed, but surely Queen was influenced by many artists. Surely you built on what came before. Of course, Brian replied. Every artist is influenced. Freddie learned from Elvis. I learned from guitarists who came before me. But there's a difference between being influenced and being a copy. Influence is when you take what others have done and use it as a foundation to build something new. Being a copy is when you lose yourself trying to replicate someone else. And that night with the broken piano, Brian smiled, though his eyes were sad with memory. That was the night we both decided to stop being copies. Freddie stopped trying to be Elvis. I stopped trying to be my father's perfect scientist son. And we started becoming the people who would create Queen. Not because we were trying to be revolutionary or different, but because we were finally, honestly, ourselves. The broken piano from that rehearsal room was eventually destroyed, hauled away as garbage years before Queen achieved fame. But the memory of that November night, the cold, the confessions, the tears, the promise, that remained. It became part of the foundation, the hidden history that shaped everything that followed. Two men, one piano, one truth. Authenticity is more valuable than imitation. And sometimes finding your own voice requires the courage to disappoint the people who think they know who you should be.